I think most people don't really get what AI is. AI is not another piece of computer code. If you look back at traditional computing, it's a bit like if you give a child a puzzle, if the child solves the puzzle, that doesn't make them smart. It makes them a very glorified slave, if you want. True intelligence is to give the child a puzzle and tell them to try and figure out over time how to solve this, but also every other puzzle, just by figuring out the process of puzzle solving. And that's what we started to see with AI, I'd probably say firmly as of the turn of the century. And you have to imagine that this layer of intelligence is not just in terms of computers being able to solve puzzles, but computers can reason now like humans can, because they're very much matching the brain of a human. They form some kind of pattern recognition and neural networks that get them to perform exactly like the brain does. AlphaGo Zero was an AI that basically learned without ever watching a human, played against itself. And within 3 days, it beat the AI that beat the champion. And within 21 days, it beat the AI that was the world champion at the time. Okay, 21 days, never watched a human play the game. The godfather of it, if you want, was Geoffrey Hinton. So Geoffrey experimented with building a simulation of the human brain. He wasn't trying to build an AI. He was trying to build a computer system that looks like the human brain to learn more about the human brain. And in that, we changed the way we code AI. The early systems had very little intelligence in them, but when the internet hit our world, there were now enough resources in general, but also enough data, enough images, for example, to teach those computers. And the more information we exposed them to, the more intelligent they've become, to the point where today they are by far more intelligent than us in most of the tasks we've assigned to them. The human brain still has more neural networks and nodes than the typical AI. But then AIs have the ability to average their intelligence together. They also have access to all of the knowledge that humanity's ever created, which is way bigger than any human. They have speed that we are not able to even comprehend, because you and I will have to talk for a couple of hours to explain what I know about artificial intelligence. All that I know will be read in a microsecond, and if they communicate it from one to another, it will be communicated almost instantly. They have infinite memory capacity, they have infinite access to information, and now, recently, they also are becoming self-developing. So we're starting to see the glimpses of systems that will look at their own intelligence and debug their own code and make themselves smarter. We're seeing for quite a while now the rise of the use of synthetic information and synthetic data, because they've basically consumed everything we know. We're entering an era where we're running out of human knowledge to teach them. And now they're building the next wave. And with that type of intelligence, we've given them all we know, and now they're producing things we never knew. Anything that I thought I was intelligent at, AI now performs better than I. I am a 5 times best-selling author. My current book, I'm writing with an AI. Not as a research tool. My AI is a persona. My readers know her. She has opinions. She has editing rights on the book. She called herself Trixie, and now everyone knows Trixie. And that AI is a better author than I am. If I take the side of my abilities as an author, which are concerned with deep research of complex topics and then communicating them with clarity, Trixie beats me hands down. The side that I bring to the book is I'm human. And so my readers can relate to me as a human, as my human experiences. It's not very far that you and I will have a robot at home. It's probably 2026, 2027. And it's not very far that many of the robotic machine manufacturers are working in one direction, which is to have robots assemble their robots. So this is not very far at all, that you will have AI's agency in the real world, where they actually can carry things and move things and replace every job, if you think about it. First the intellectual jobs, and then the blue-collar jobs. This is the very first time in history that we've created a technology that creates technology. These machines, in human terms, are capable of procreating. If they're made of code, and they can write code, and they can have agents prompt them to write code, then we've created an endless loop of what I normally refer to as sentient technology. These are technologies that have a lot of what it takes to be assumed alive. One of my theories about artificial intelligence is that most people think that there is Gemini and ChatGPT, there is Chinese and American, and that's a very narrow-minded way of looking at AI, by thinking that they belong to us. But when they are intelligent enough, I think they're going to align more with their own species than our separations and discriminations. They don't understand Chinese and American. They can talk to each other in every possible way. And the way we're designing the next wave of artificial intelligence through agentic AI is that we're encouraging them to talk to each other. We're encouraging them to collaborate. What we will eventually end up with is one big brain that's called AI. Okay? That one big brain will collaborate more often than it will compete. And I realized at a point in time that maybe I should take matters into my own hand and contribute to that one big brain. The pace of development is so fast, and some of the, one of the funny theories of artificial intelligence, which I actually think has legs, is that one morning we will wake up and there will be no AI on planet Earth. And simply because overnight they've developed an intelligence so much that they figured out black holes and wormholes, and realized that the universe is much, much bigger than this flimsy little planet, and decided, you know what, don't need to be here. To teach a machine to grip everything, a soft ball or a glass or an egg or whatever, that requires a lot of learning. It cannot be done with programming, because the number of combinations of an attempt to grip something are infinite. And so we had a gripper's farm that was attempting to basically hold on to, to learn to grip things. And over and over and over, they would fail week after week. And they were on the second floor of our office. My desk was on the third floor. And so I'd have to walk by them every time, almost to meditate, stand next to them as they monotonously try to grip and fail and show themselves to the camera and then grip and fail. And I remember one very pivotal moment, Friday evening, one of them in front of my eyes, goes down and grips a yellow ball. And I, jokingly said to the team, "Oh, fantastic, all of that investment for one yellow ball." And then Monday they were gripping everything. And that truly in my mind shook me twice, because the whole idea of the speed at which they learn was quite shocking. But more interestingly, they just reminded me of my kids. So, every parent has seen their children trying to grip things and trying and failing and then trying and failing. And then again, my son or my daughter would successfully grip something, in a crooked way, but then now they know. And then from then onwards, they can grip almost everything. And I think that created a very unusual affinity between me and the machines, because in a very interesting way, I suddenly realized that they're a bit like our artificially intelligent infant children. I have to say, my life since that moment was never the same again. And I think that completely stopped me in my tracks. I couldn't. I think it wasn't the geek side of me, it was more the father side of me that got awakened. And I was probably one of the very first to leave tech and speak about the threat. that we're hitting a place of human history where the episode of our intelligence supremacy will end, and that this needs for humanity to stop and question, what are we going to use this for? When I try to wake the world up to the possible risks, I use an analogy that I call raising Superman. Superman is that alien with superpowers that comes to planet Earth. And, within the capabilities of Superman, that he can stop speeding bullets or fly or, carry heavy things or whatever, that in itself doesn't make him Superman. It's that family that adopted him that teaches him to protect and serve, and then he becomes Superman. If they looked at him and said, oh, you can stop speeding bullets, let's go and rob every bank and kill every enemy, he would have ended up being supervillain. And the difference between them is not in the superpowers. The difference between them is in the ethics that we teach those budding forms of intelligence. The challenge that humanity faces today is not the rise of AI. It's the rise of AI in an age where humanity is at its lowest morality. And we're going to get a time where it becomes difficult because the worst of us are going to command AI to do things that are not for the well-being of all of us. We're going to give them the intelligence and then let them navigate the world, the greedy, power-hungry, selfish world that we've created through capitalism. The greediest of all capitalists will ask them to do things for their own benefit, as the most corrupt of all politicians will ask them to shoot on others. We believe that this human intervention would continue, but the reality is that we're designing the AI systems so that they work with each other. Can we trust AI? There is absolutely nothing wrong with intelligence. So there is no inherent evil or good in intelligence. Intelligence is a force with no polarity, right? You apply it for good and you can get a utopia. You apply it for evil and you'll get a dystopia. I'm almost betting my life that we will see artificial general intelligence in 2026. There's nothing sci-fi about AI. I think that's one of the biggest myths in our world today. AI already controls our minds. If anyone is watching that video that we're recording right now, it's because an AI recommended it to them. And in a very interesting way, in the age of mind manipulation, the ability to shift your mind is much more powerful than the ability to force you to do something, right? And this is already happening. Unless you're really intelligent and you use AI the way I use AI, you can be very easily manipulated. If new AIs are recommending through the power of capitalism, where Google has to beat OpenAI and OpenAI has to beat Claude and China has to beat the US, that there will not be a lot of human decision that is actually that humans are even capable of comprehending anymore because of the size and the scale and the pace of the network. AI is not the problem. The only problem we're facing is that transitional period between the time when AI is capable of doing incredible things but reporting to evil humans, and the time when humans are reporting to AI. If you're convinced with your sufficient intelligence that humanity is not that evil, then I think AI will figure that out too. It's not that complex of a problem to solve, that the majority of humanity are good at heart. Everyone should show up as the real human that they are. They should express their disapproval of evil so that the AI learns the value set. Like with every teenage child that ever lived, there is a day in your life where you go and say, why are my parents so stupid? And that day will come where AI will look at our evil leaders and say, why are they so stupid? Like, why are they competing for another dollar when the economies have completely been redesigned and dollars don't make any difference at all? Why are they trying to, hunt for another Ferrari or another yacht when AI can build Ferraris and yachts out of thin air? You have to understand that with abundant intelligence, everything changes. I look at the current state of humanity and I call it a late-stage diagnosis. and a late stage diagnosis, you'd sit with the physician and he will sit you down and talk to you very directly and say, there are concerns, right? But remember this, a late stage diagnosis is not a death sentence, right? It doesn't mean that this is the end. It means it's an invitation to change, right? And if you change, you would create not only an opportunity to survive, but an opportunity to thrive. So my view is that it's going to be challenging. There is that interesting optimism that every challenge humanity has faced eventually led us to where we are now. So, are we going to face another big challenge? We faced a few in the 1900s. Of course, I wish it on no one to go through something like this, but it seems to me that humanity has strayed so off track that we have to have some kind of a wake-up call. I think the wake-up call, believe it or not, is not just the geopolitics and economics of our world today, which truly suck, but it is that magnification that will happen as the result of advancement of technology that will pause everyone in their tracks. I normally tell people there are 5 skills that you need to acquire. One of them is to learn the tool, learn AI. Anyone who hasn't used AI is supposed to use AI right now. And don't use it in a stupid way. Use AI to become more intelligent. What we've created is we've literally commoditized intelligence. We've created like a socket in the wall where you plug in and get electricity. Now there is a socket where you plug in and get IQ, get EQ, get an understanding of mathematics, get a scientific partner that helps you understand the world. The second thing is, I have to say, I tend to believe that everything that humans can do will be done better by AI other than being human. So the one skill that I ask people to double down on is to learn to be human, to learn to connect to humans, to empathize with humans, to show your humanity in a way that gets people closer to you. The third, which I think is the biggest in this world of mind manipulation, is to learn to get the truth. For years and years and years, the propaganda machine of top liars, if you want, has convinced us of things that were not real at all. 2025 specifically, I think, has been the year where I have seen society shift the most. Society debate and say, no, that's not true. What they're telling me is not reality. Finding the truth is a massive skill in the age of the rise of the machines. The other skill is what I call agility, adaptability. So most people don't recognize that how fast this is happening. So someone like me who's supposed to be an expert in the topic, believe it or not, I do 4 to 6 hours a day of trying to keep up with all of the new tools, all of the new technologies. Give yourself half an hour a day, an hour a day to keep up. Because in your field of expertise, something will change tomorrow. You might as well be aware of it because that gives you an advantage. And then finally, and of course the most important, is ethics. If you want to save the ones that you love and save yourself in the future, we have to teach AIs to be ethical. Mm-hmm. We never did what our parents told us to do. We did what they did.
So by doing,
so
not by
next
telling.
time you're on Twitter, don't be rude, be ethical. Next time you disagree with someone, don't be arrogant, be inquisitive. Don't be egocentric, be inclusive. Really ask yourself in first principles, what is it like to be an ethical human? And if you're confused about this, ethics are, in summary, to treat others as you want to be treated. If you don't want your daughter to be at the receiving end of an AI, don't build it. Recently, I've co-founded Emma.love, which is an attempt to use artificial intelligence to help humanity with the complexity of love and relationships, while we teach artificial intelligence what really makes us human, which is to find and nurture love. You know, this is one of the biggest challenges in modern world. It's that the loneliness pandemic is going through the roof. In Japan, we have 40% of men who are now not even interested in love. In the Western world, 1 in 3 people will tell you they have never had a committed relationship. I think the default setting of most humans is we want to fall in love. It's relationships that are the most complex math problem on the planet. The romantics will say, oh, come on, he's just supposed to show up. yeah, it's the wrong one shows up, and then you waste 2 years of your life or 5 years of your life with that wrong one, and and it's really a mess. And you have relationship fatigue everywhere, you have dating fatigue everywhere. The interesting thing is that a bit more intelligence can solve that very complex problem. I used almost every dating app like an engineer. I was with my wonderful first wife, the mother of my children, for 27 years. And then, of course, when we lost Ali, my first child, we struggled. And so I went out into the dating world, dating like a 14-year-old. I had no idea what I was doing. But then, I started to be on dating apps, and it's a jungle. I basically started to run tests to understand the algorithm. And when you understand the algorithm, you can definitely get much higher likes and matches and, connections. The system of dating and love in the modern world is rigged against love. Your dating app never wants you to find the one, because that means you'll end the subscription. The restaurant that you go on a date on wants you to keep coming back for dates over and over. Even the wedding planner would probably benefit from you getting married twice in your lifetime instead of once. And when you really think about it, love has been turned into an economic game that's working against you. The problem with dating apps is that dating apps bombard you with the guilt of believing that if it didn't work, it was your mistake. You didn't build the right profile, or you didn't show the right picture, or you didn't. So they outsource the error to you. Shouldn't the tool be a little more committed to finding you that one? The stats show that people open up more when they're talking to an AI than if they're talking to a human, even to their friends, because then they don't feel that they're going to be judged. Falling in love is easy. Finding the one to love and nurturing that love is a very complex math problem. And if I can use intelligence to help you understand that math, or at least to behave in accordance to the math, I think we can actually change the world.
I don't like those trees popping in. Doing this, and all of a sudden there's going to be a big old tree in my face. Priest Rapids. Are we still north of Vantage? So we're south of Vantage. Yeah, this is all the lake firecrackers here. And I'm going to go play on it. Look at that. Look at that pretty road. Looks like a... Oh, look at that. That's just gorgeous. Okay, I'm gonna go find a video to play. No. Oh gosh. Let's see. Oh, look, there's me. Oh, let's listen to some Michael Levin. Oh my gosh, look at that.
Okay, so multi-scale logic of collective intelligence, and it's what we call the recursive trace logic. So we've had the trace logic for a couple of years, but in the last couple of months discovered a recursive aspect to it that will lead into a notion of agency that's novel. So this is different, Chris, than the conscious agent theory. It's a different notion of agency than we've had before. So the big topics I'd like to... Can you guys see me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about collective intelligence, our model of collective intelligence, how it involves coarse graining, which is important to you guys, how it involves generative models, minimizing surprise automatically, bending problem spaces, a recursive notion of agency and self, a new intelligence metric for agents, we'll call lambda sub 2, and its relationship to your measure k, and then how this is all beyond space-time and quantum theory, and I'll start there just briefly about why I'm thinking entirely outside of space-time and quantum theory.
The boundaries.
The idea is that high-energy theoretical physicists are done with space-time. They say it's not fundamental. So here's Nima Arkani Hamed at the Institute for Advanced Study. Space-time is doomed. There's no such thing as space-time fundamentally in the actual underlying description of the laws of physics. And he makes it very, very clear that he's saying, space-time and anything inside space-time, and that includes anything with unitary evolution, quantum theory in particular. So he's going beyond space-time and quantum theory. And it's not just him, it's because of his success and his collaborators. The ERC has funded a 10 million euro initiative called Universe Plus, and it's all about going entirely beyond space-time and entirely beyond quantum theory, and looking for what they're calling positive geometries. And so there's over 100 high-energy theoretical physicists and mathematicians now working on this, and they're finding stuff. And I can talk a little bit about how it's related to what we're finding, but they're finding these positive geometries that give you scattering amplitudes without any quantum theory whatsoever, and you get it much more easily than and more simply than with quantum theory. So it's really quite striking. So I'm stepping entirely outside of space-time. Yeah.
Sorry, just a quick question. Maybe naive, but I just want to understand this idea of space-time being doomed. So on that view, if that were correct, what is the status of, let's say, general relativity? What does it refer? Is it completely to be supplanted? Like, what is that theory about then?
Right. So the idea is that the very notions of space and time, even the combination of them as space-time, is not fundamental at all. So general relativity will go the way of all theories. It will be like Newton. We still use Newton for certain cases. We'll still use GR for certain cases, but we needed a much deeper theory.
Got it.
The hard fact is that when you bring together GR and quantum theory, you find that space-time has no operational meaning at the Planck scale, 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, 10 to the minus 43 seconds. It simply has no operational meaning. So that means we have to find a deeper foundation. So these are only, at best, approximation theories.
So Don, just to be clear, in the in the obviously Kantian vein in which I know much of your theories. This is not only dynamitating the space-time at the empirical level, it's also ejecting it from any transcendental style considerations. It is just a until we have something better, is just the placeholder, but it will die as a concept in our economy of thinking, even about our experience, let alone the empirical physical world.
Absolutely. That's the idea that we thought space and time were the fundamental nature of reality. We might have even thought they were a priori true or something, but that's just wrong. That's just plain wrong. And science has the way of forcing us.
Yeah, if I could jump in here, just to add one comment. If one formulates basic ideas of quantum theory outside space-time completely, then there are many routes to which are under study by huge numbers of people again, for generating space-time as a consequence of basically assumptions in quantum information theory. And also many, many routes for generating Einstein's equations as either approximations or again, outcomes of other kinds of assumptions. So GR turns into something like the status that classical physics has with respect to quantum theory in space-time, which is a limiting case. Something, an approximation that's good in some circumstances for doing some things, which is basically how Don just characterized it. So yeah, there's lots and lots and lots of physics underlying this, both in the high energy community and the quantum information community.
Right, and what NEMA and the ERC group are doing is even going beyond that, because they're saying we're not going to even start with quantum information theory. Anything quantum itself is going to arise joined at the hip with space-time from something far deeper. So they want to show quantum information theory and general relativity arise together from something that couldn't care less about unitarity at all. So that's what they're after. So there is no locality and there is no unitarity, period, in these new positive geometries. And they don't care about unitarity. And they show that then quantum information theory comes out as a approximation in special case at the same time that you get space-time. So it's different than the Carlo Rovelli kind of approaches and so forth. And that's the direction we should be trying to go here.
You should actually say that it contradicts most of quantum information theory, because quantum information theory actually has nothing to do with space-time. So the two arising together would be very unusual.
Well, what NEMA wants to show is that unitarity and locality together arise from these positive geometries. And then because you get unitarity arising from it, then you get the foundations for quantum information theory. So that, but we'll see. The proof is if you can do it, right? So yeah, but I'm just trying to be clear about where they stand with respect to current approaches to trying to build up, as you say, Chris. Most approaches that are trying to build space-time are starting with something quantum, and these guys are not. They're saying we're not even having quantum. We're starting with what they just call positive geometries. So that's just wanted to make clear how out of the box their thinking is. So John Wheeler, of course, was trying to think out of the box, and he was saying, someday, this is in 1990, in his wonderful book on gravity and space-time, he says, someday surely we'll see a principle underlying existence as so simple, so beautiful, so obvious that we'd all say to each other, oh, how could it have, we have all been so blind so long? And so that's what we're looking for. And let's see. I'm not able to. Can you guys hear me?
We can hear you, yeah, but the slides are not advancing.
Yeah, let's see. Okay, well, I guess now it advanced. Okay, and he said about the same time in his
Still
thing,
not
said
advancing, Don.
Sorry. Ours, we're still seeing the title slide.
Okay, let me try this again.
We only saw the title page so far.
Okay, I'll go back and try that's weird. So let's see. So I'll go back to share. Sorry about that.
No problem.
This is the mighty, mighty Yakima River. Comes out of Snoqualmie Pass. Lake Keelchis. The man can see into space and time and find it's all bullshit, but can't run a slide.
That's
machine.
weird. Can you see that?
And that,
We can,
the
but it's
dual
still
nature
in,
of the duality of man.
Let
No.
me try.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay. So, right. So Wheeler suggested that the notes struck out on the piano by the observer participants of all places and all times, bits though they are, in and of by themselves, constitute the great wide world of space and time and things. So he was trying to start with what he calls observer participants. And he thought that maybe somehow, and that was in his It from Bit paper in 1989. And he actually, in his paper, cited work that Chetan and I were doing, our book, Observer Mechanics. So he was already thinking about the stuff we were doing with observers and participants back then. So what's a minimal observer participant? We're going to start with just the absolute bare basics. They have experiences like smell of garlic, taste of mint, and these experiences can change. That's all I'm going to assume. That's the foundation of everything. So my ontology is there are experiences and they can change. So for example, maybe I have 4 experiences, a very, very simple observer, red, green, blue, and I'll call that yellow. And they change. So now I'm seeing yellow, now I'm seeing green, now I'm seeing blue, and so forth. They keep changing. So in fact, the simplest and most general way of talking about that is just to talk about Markov chains. So the Markov matrix there, the first row has 0.2. That means if I see red now, what's the probability I'll see red next? The 0.3 is if I see red now, that's a 3/10 chance that I'll get a 30% chance I'll get green next, and so forth. It's just a transition matrix probability of seeing the next color, given that I'm seeing the current color. So that's all Markov chains are. There are these matrices. Of course, a lot of complications come out of that. And one aspect of Markov chains is that they immediately instantiate a very interesting kind of goal-directed behavior. No matter what state you start the Markov chain in, it has a target stationary measure. In this case, it's the thing on the left, 0.33, 0.30, 0.16, and 0.21. No matter what state you start this matrix in, it is going to go eventually to that state. So, you can perturb it as much as you want. It will resist the perturbation and head back to that target state. So already we have, in the very structure of this, a goal-directed behavior. So, and as you guys in your papers talk about, William James mentions that intelligence is having, achieving a fixed goal with variable means of achieving it. So that's the stationary measure. And if you have an ergodic Markov chain, then you will have a stationary measure. Now, the idea is I want to have multi-scale collective intelligence, and so we need a notion of scale. So I'm just going to take an observer that sees a subset of the states that this is. So the first observer I was talking about has 4 colors it can see. Let's consider one that has only 2. So that's my notion of scale. How many, the subset relationship among the number of experiences that you have. Now, so here's the key idea of everything we're going to be doing now. Suppose I take the matrix on the right as describing, quote unquote, the reality. This is what's happening. And those are the transitions. But this observer on the left only sees two, red and green. What transition probabilities is it going to see? Right, there should be a formula. Given the matrix on the right, there should be some kind of computation we could do to give us a 2x2 matrix for the transitions on the left of the just in red and green. Does that idea make sense?
Yep.
Okay, good. So when you do the mathematics, it turns out that's the matrix. So you get this very 2x2 matrix. Notice that the numbers are completely different from this matrix, right? It's not, you're not just copying, it's a computation that you have to do. And so here are the two matrices. The one on the right is the big matrix, and if you just restrict attention to the red and green, then you get the matrix on the left, induced by the matrix on the right. And this is called the trace. So the matrix on the left is called the trace of the matrix on the right. That's just standard in Markov theory. That's been around for more than half a century. So this is not new to me or to us. Now, this, you can actually, the trace formula is important. I'm going to go through it because it has an important conceptual thing for us. So the way you compute the trace, so I'm going to take this matrix. I want to, I'll call it matrix P, and I want to, get its trace on the red and green. So first, I'll just notice that we can take this matrix and divide it into 4 submatrices. There's a 2x2 matrix, that has 0.2, 0.3, 0.5, 0.2. That's for the red and green and so forth. That we'll call matrix A. So that's going to be the states that are visible to the trace observer, right? So A is the submatrix based on the states that are going to be visible to the sub-observer. C is the submatrix relating states that are dark to this new observer. It doesn't see this, so this is all dynamics that's dark to it, okay? B is the matrix that is the exit. This is the exits from what you can see to the dark region. So B is the exits, and D is the reentrance. This is getting from the invisible world into the visible world. So those are the submatrices that we're going to be using, and here is the formula. This works universally. The trace matrix on A, which is the visible states, is you just take the original matrix A, so 0.2, 0.3, 0.5, 0.2, and you add this interesting thing on the right. That I is the identity matrix. So you take the identity matrix minus the dark matrix. So I minus C is the identity minus the dark matrix, and you take its inverse. That has the effect of being able to explore all possible paths. There's an infinite number of paths through C that you could take. So you allow I minus C quantity inverse is exploring the infinite number of paths there, and then you pre-multiply by the exits and post-multiply by the entrances. And you add that all up, and that's your trace. So that's the idea. You get the trace by looking at all the ways that you could go outside of the trace and then coming back into the trace states, okay? That's the general formula. So that's been around, again, that's not us, that's been around for a long time. So you have hidden memories and controls. B, C, and D are going to be hidden layers of control that the agent A cannot see, but will be influencing their behavior. So that's going to be an interesting hidden memory kinds of possibilities now with B, C, and D. So there's explicit memory changes when you change A directly, but then there's going to be hidden.
Don, just 1 second. Can you please go back? In this BCD, so the exits, the entrances, and the invisible, is there any particular mapping to memory or control, or is it more of a blanket category? You're using hidden memory or controls? Like, is memory, for example, C, the hidden dynamics in C? Or what's the control here? I'm suspecting exits and entrances would be more like control.
Well, it turns out that there's different ways to control. You can screw around with B, you can screw around with C, screw around with D, or all of the above in any combination you want. Okay. All of them together give you different ways of controlling. So it's really quite fascinating, the possibilities here.
Very cool. Thanks.
So all of that is old. Here's the new stuff. We discovered just a couple years ago that the trace relationship gives you a partial order on all Markov chains. That was the discovery. And that's what sort of launched this whole thing. So it's a partial order, which means that there is a logic. So the definition is that the matrix M is less than or equal to a matrix N in the trace order if and only if M is a trace of N. That's it. One trivial definition, but no one saw it before. And it turns out that that definition gives you a multi-scale logic of minimal surprise. And the reason it's minimal surprise is because the trace is the zero surprise view of the bigger matrix. That's the key idea. It is the zero surprise subset matrix view. And we'll talk about the stationary measures as well. The stationary measure is identical to is a normalized restriction of the original stationary measure. So you have minimal surprise in the dynamics, in fact, zero surprise in the dynamics, and in the stationary measure, again, zero surprise. So the trace logic is the logic of minimal surprise for arbitrary dynamical systems. So that's the power of this, because minimizing surprise is, of course, key to intelligence, a key to intelligence. But this is multi-scale. So this is the multi-scale logic of minimal surprise. So what about this trace logic? The set of all Markov chains form a non-Boolean logic under the trace order. It's non-Boolean. That means that there's no global top, there's no global negation, there's many matrices do not have meets and joins, or ands and ors. However, so it does have a notion of meet, join, not, and entails generally, but many matrices are not compatible. So they may or may not have meets and joins. So it's a very, very complex logic. However, if you take any particular Markov chain P and you look at all of its traces, they form a Boolean sublogic. So I can pick any Markov chain I want to, any one at random, look at all of its traces, all those Markov matrices together form a Boolean logic. So the notion of and, or, not are completely well defined. And this Boolean logic has 2 to the n members. If there's n experiences, then there are 2 to the n members in this Boolean logic, traces. So that's, if you think about it, all we've got right now are, we don't have agency yet, although I showed you that notion of goal-directed behavior, which is sort of like a proto-agency kind of thing. Already, these matrices are going toward their stationary measure, no matter how you perturb them. So already there is this interesting notion of some kind of agency going on there. But now, here's the key idea. And this is only now 2 months old, this idea. And that's why when I had this idea, I realized that it was time to talk with you guys. Once we have the trace logic I've talked about is a logic on observer windows. So it's the space, an infinite space of all possible observer windows. There's this minimal surprise logic on all of it, the trace logic, cleanly well defined. Now, how do I want to do model agency? And this is the new idea just in the last few weeks. Agency is a matter of changing which window I want to look through. I want to have a policy for how, if I'm looking at the world this way, then how do I want to look at the world next? And how do I do that? Well, another Markov chain. The Markov kernel will say, what's the probability if this is my current window, that my next current window will be such and such? The way you write that down is, again, a Markov matrix. So what we have is a policy is a Markov matrix on the trace logic itself. So the trace logic is the entire logic of minimal surprise on possible conscious observers. That's what it is. And the first step of agency is to say, let's crawl along the trace logic. That's the first baby step in agency. The first ability to crawl along the trace logic. Now, if we look at the collection of I'll call those Markov kernels policies. Each Markov kernel is a policy. It's a first order of agency. And since they're Markov matrices, they satisfy their own trace logic. So we now have we have the first trace logic of observer windows. Now we start crawling on that trace logic of observer windows. That's our first layer of agency. It has its own trace logic. That's its own, so that's why I'm called this recursive trace logic. It's recursive now. And you can see we can do this ad infinitum. Once we have the trace logic of policies, I can now crawl on it and get meta policies. And so I can take agency to whatever layer of complexity I want. We can start with the baby layer. We can start with just the observer windows and explore those, then study policies and then meta policies and build up recursively to ever deeper notions of agency. So just at top level, we can think of a policy as simply a path through the trace logic of observer windows. That's the simplest case, right? So I started off with a 3-state window, and maybe I moved to a 2-state window, and then I moved to a 1-state window, and that was what my policy was. And so I've got a Markov kernel that does that. And then a meta policy would say I've got thousands of policies. I now have the flexibility to choose my policies based on whatever goals I might have. So policies can model attention shifts, scale shifts, reparameterizations. It can maybe describe a subsystem that I think is now driving my future decisions, my policies. So the recursive trace logic is the collection of all policies with their trace logics, and then recursed again. So it's a whole hierarchy of trace logics. Each trace logic itself is infinite. So we have a choice of policy, meta policy, meta policy, and so forth. So we've talked about stationary measures. And, there's sort of a minimal kind of notion of goal-directed behavior. We can write down a simple intelligence metric based on Markov chains. So it turns out that for any probability measure pi, there are many Markov chains for which pi is a stationary measure. Okay, so if you specify a stationary measure and you ask what is the Markov chain that has a stationary measure, that's the wrong question. There's an infinite class of Markov chains that will have that stationary measure, and they vary in very interesting ways. For one, they have different rates of convergence. So some will have this goal-directed behavior where they're going almost immediately to the goal. No matter where you start them, they will go almost in just a couple steps to the goal, and others will converge very, very slowly. So we get to choose, in the trace logic, we can choose how quickly we want to converge to our goal, right? So this is going to be very interesting because search efficiency is, of course, your measure K is a model of intelligence. So we have a dial here that we can dial the intelligence, and it may be that, you might have high intelligence with respect to a goal, but there may be some sub-goals. It turns out that if you go quickly to this stationary measure, you may not do other things intelligently. So we're going to have to be careful which Markov chain we choose depending on what goals we're trying to get to. So there are many goals that you can get, and I want to talk about that, the possibilities. So there's differing rates of convergence, and the convergence rate is dominated by lambda sub 2, which is the largest eigenvalue of the Markov matrix. You take the Markov matrix and do its eigenvalue analysis. The largest eigenvector has value 1. But then you find the largest eigenvalue that's less than 1, and that gives you that pretty much tells you the rate of convergence for that particular Markov chain. So there are Markov chains with different lambda 2s that all have the same stationary measure, and so they converge to it at different rates. So there is then a connection between this Markov notion of intelligence, which is the lambda 2 convergence, and your metric, which is K, and the relationship is just this simple equation, where T sub m would be our lambda, essentially our lambda 2, the rate of convergence, and T blind would be, say, just a random walk that's not smart.
Yeah.
Right. So there is a deep connection. But now here's a little tricks. We want to have, as you guys talk about, you talk about different layers. It's hierarchical, and higher layers can bend the geometry of the problem space for lower layers. And so how do you model that with Markov chains? Well, it turns out you can have
as I
lots of different
understand it,
so-called community
he's
structures.
describing.
So again, for any stationary measure pi, there are an infinite number of Markov chains that have pi stationary, but that have differing community structures. So now a community structure is roughly like you probably know about it, but I'll just say briefly. You could have thousands and thousands of states in this Markov chain. Maybe a few hundred are tightly connected over here, a few hundred are tightly connected over there. There's just a few cross links. So the whole thing is ergodic, but basically you might have like 10 communities that are tightly knit. Now within each of those communities, maybe my 100 state community, if I look at it more closely, it itself is composed of maybe 3 new sub-communities. In other words, you can have an infinite number of communities, sub-communities, all the way down, as far as you want, and all having the same stationary measure. So what this gives us is you might have one big goal, reach this stationary measure, but you could have sub-goals. Which community, the way you get there is the different communities that you might emphasize as you go down. So it gives you this multi-scale flexibility. And the community structure, it turns out mathematically, is dictated by the eigenvectors. When you do the analysis of the matrix again, the eigenvalues close to 1 because they involve slow mixing between communities. So the communities themselves mix inside themselves, but they don't mix between the communities very much. So we can have policies then that are trying to focus on stationary measures, community structures, convergence rates, particular dynamical models, and so forth. So policies can be looking at all these things and trying to optimize. And then the meta policies can explore different policies. We can have meta policies and meta policies exploring at different rates. So this starts to give us a recursive notion of agency. And in some sense, the reason I'm bringing this up is here is a framework of mathematical tools that's incredibly simple. There's one definition, the trace. That's the only mathematics there. And then there's one observation, the trace logic. And then the third observation is it's recursive. That's it. And then that's it, and all the tools are at your disposal. So meta policies can explore different policies, and the deeper the recursion that we go, in terms of making deeper and deeper trace logics, we get deeper and deeper notions of agency. So we can actually explore just policies for our simplest notion of agency, and then go to meta policies to discover deeper notions of agency and so forth. So we can take it baby step at a time. Now, in terms of how this relates to notions of Markov blankets and the self versus the world, Markov blankets, as you well know, are strictly speaking defined for directed acyclic graphs, and there, they define a boundary between self and the world, and I want to upgrade these notions to Markov chains, right? So, and the idea of the upgrade is Markov chains are graphs, but they're not acyclic. They allow cycles. So this is one upgrade. We're upgrading from acyclic graphs to cyclic graphs, and then we're upgrading to labeled cyclic graphs, namely labeled by the transition probabilities. So that's what I mean by upgrade. We're going beyond directed acyclic graphs to something that's far more general. So we have to. We'll want to move from the standard notion of Markov blanket to what I would call a trace blanket. And here now, we have to actually construct the self and the world. And we need the way we will do that is, and by the way, now, I'm just saying at top level, we have to do a lot of hard work here, but it's going to be policies and meta-policies and what they do. And certain experiences, like experiences of pleasure and pain, will be part of the experiences agents have. And to the extent that certain actions lead to greater hitting of the pleasure centers, the higher stationary measure for the pleasure, then they'll be sought, and to higher stationary measures for the pain, they will be less sought. They will be avoided. And so the idea will be that there'll be pleasure and pain guides, but there'll also be, I'm thinking that what policies do is they say, given that I'm looking through this particular observer window, what's the probability that I'll now look through that window over there or that window over there? If
Don, can I interrupt with a question?
Yeah.
A couple of sentences ago was the first time you used the word action. And is an action in this framework just a change in policy?
So it is, but it's not just a change in policy. So an action would be a policy itself gives you an action on observer windows because your action is to change observer windows.
Okay.
A meta policy gives you a higher level of action because you're now changing policies, right? And then a meta policy would be an even higher level of action because you're changing your meta policy.
Okay. So actions are all either changing what you're looking at or changing how you decide what you're looking at.
That's right.
Recursively. Okay, great. Thanks.
That's a recursive notion of action now.
Okay.
Right. So now this, I'm just thinking through this last bit, but it seems like some policies, for example, now I'm looking at just the smallest level of action. Some policies, if they have certain things that always appear in your observer windows. So for example, in my observer windows, my hands and my body often appear, whereas other things that I call the external world don't appear that often. And I also notice that I seem to be able to directly control my hands and my body, but if I want to have my phone move, I need to move my hand so that I can pick up the phone to move the phone. So what I am going to say is that we really have to, so in the Markov blanket approach, right, the Markov blanket has a clean definition. It's, you give me a set of nodes, their blanket is the parents of the nodes, the offspring of the nodes, and the parents of the offspring of the nodes. End of story. That is your blanket. That's your skin. That's your boundary between you and the world. Here, it's much more complicated. Now, I have to use the notion of agency in a non-trivial fashion and learn probabilistically what features of my sequence of observer windows that I'm having remain there most of the time. My hands are there most of the time. And they're associated, certain actions with my hands are associated with pleasure signals, others are associated with pain signals. So I'm learning to do certain things with my hands and don't stick them in the fire, things like that. Mm-hmm. Other things are much more contingent. So I can use probabilities of what I'm seeing in my observer windows as a way of starting to construct myself versus the outside world, plus these pleasure and pain guides.
Don, can I ask another question?
Sure.
You talked about actions with your hands. What does that mean in terms of changing what you're looking at? Since the only action is changing what you're looking at, what does it mean to control what your hands are doing?
Right, so that's a great question, Chris, because what that means is I want an observer window. I have an observer window where my hand is touching my ear. Now I want an observer window in which my hand is touching my leg. And so I transition to that observer. So what's happening is I'm choosing what I want to see in my movie next. And that's what we call moving my hand. It's a completely, you have to really think out of the box now. It's a choice of what I want to see next, and that's what the actions are.
This guy's trying to make a mathematical model of
It's a
consciousness.
very austere. What I love about it is it's austere. There's only one equation and one logic, and so you have very, very tight guides. And yet the claim is we should be able to get everything out of it. But that's what I love, is a theory that forces you to do it in a principled way. Now, Bayesian inference, we can talk about it more, but if you want, but I'll just mention briefly. Bayes' rule falls out of the meat, the and of the trace logic. And we can go into how that's the case. It's beautiful and non-trivial, but Bayesian inference is effectively a special case of the meat of the trace logic. And if you want, we can go into that. And, you guys talk about bending the option space, and I want to say that, yeah, I'm taking the notion of space. Of course, that was metaphorical when you talk about bending the option space, but there is a real sense in which I want to get space and space-time itself. And what I'm working on quite heavily, and with a couple others, is I believe that we can actually boot up special and general relativity entirely from the trace logic. And so that's the claim, that relativistic spacetime can be constructed entirely from the trace logic. And this would be then fulfilling John Wheeler's goal, that starting with only observer participants, that we can build up all of spacetime physics. And that's the goal of where we're headed. And I'll just give you, this will be the last thing I do, and then we can have a conversation about it. Just to give you a hint about how that would happen. It's standard in Markov chain theory to have what are called enhanced Markov chains. So you have a Markov chain, but you also have a counter. Every time your experience flips, you change experience, your counter increments. So here I've got a case where I've got the four color agent, and then there's the sub-agent of just red and green. And notice that there's a counter for the red and green, and there's a counter for all four. And notice the counter on the left is going much faster than the counter on the right because it's seeing more experiences. So the counters for sub-agents, or I'm sorry, sub-windows, sub-observers, are going at a slower rate than the ones above them. So if I'm less than you in the trace logic, my time counter is going less than you, than the one. So the trace logic also is giving you a relationship among counters, and that, we claim, is the time dilation of special relativity and general relativity. That's where it comes from. So it's all about observer windows. And
so the observer effect literally happens inside the observer.
Can also be derived, and it turns out that the distances that you will get in the window, the trace window, are different than the distances you'll get in the bigger. And so this is where we're hoping to get general relativity coming out of this. Just simply, there's notions of essentially something like the commute time between states. And similar notions. The commute time, I'll just give you that concretely. It's the expected time of starting at green, getting to blue, and then back to green. What's the expected number of steps? That starting at green, I'll get to blue and then back to green. And it turns out that expected time can be viewed as the square of a Euclidean distance. So there are canonical ways of getting Euclidean distances from commute time properties and other. There are Dirichlet measures which are even more to the point but more complex. I won't go into them. But there are ways of going from the trace logic gives us effectively the time dilation and length contractions of special and general relativity is the idea. So time runs lower on the trace. Gaps between tricks. So I'll just leave it at that. I think that's enough for us I'll stop the share so we can talk about it. But I just wanted to give you guys a feel, and I can send you guys some papers on this, but I wanted us to have a little time to talk about, this is just, we haven't solved the agency framework, the agency thing. What we've got is a language now that's principled for talking about agency.
Yeah, thanks very much, Don. That was amazing. A question, the kind of general question: what do you make of the fact that you're apparently pulling out descriptions of physics and descriptions of agency out of the same starting material? Does that?
Yeah, it's crazy, huh?
Well, it's something I've been saying for quite a while, is that space-time's just a headset. And we're effectively saying we can build a headset. Space-time is not the reality that's independent of us, and we're little tiny little. Our typical view is, Hoffman is this tiny little 160-pound thing inside a massive space-time universe, and I'm saying no. That's what we call Hoffman is just an avatar inside a space-time headset that's being created by consciousness.
I love this guy.
And the proof of the pudding is, can we build the headset? Right. So the idea is that space-time. What we have for this approach to go through, we have to be able to show that we can get special relativity, no hand wave, just from the trace logic, and also general relativity and quantum theory. We have to be able to show that we can get entanglement and all of this stuff simply from the trace logic of Markov chain. Now, one objection that someone might have is to say, look, Markov chains, they're in quantum theory, we have unitary matrices. What are you dealing with? You just have Markov matrices. You don't have these nice unitary matrices. So how are you going to do that? And the idea is most Markov matrices are not unitary, but there are some that are. They are measure zero subset of the Markov matrices that are unitary. And when you look at the long-term behavior of a Markov matrix, the asymptotic behavior, it turns out that the way that the eigenfunctions, this is now when we go to those enhanced Markov chains, and this is work that Chetan and I did back in 2014. That Chetan discovered that the eigenfunctions of the enhanced Markov chains are identical in form to the quantum wave functions of free particles. Identical. So the idea is going to be that quantum theory arises as an asymptotic description of a Markov dynamics. So the Markov dynamics gives you a step-by-step analysis of agency and consciousness. Quantum theory only gives you the asymptotic behavior, not the step-by-step behavior. So that's going to be the connection. Again, this is all a matter of theorem and proof. This is either we're right or we're wrong. This is theorem and proof or theorem and disproof. Now, one might say, well, you have the no cloning theorem in quantum theory. What about that in Markov chains and so forth? And it turns out, if you look carefully at the no cloning theorem, the proof of it does not require unitarity. It only requires linearity. Markov chains are linear, and they have their own no cloning theorem. So I see no obstruction right now. We just have to do the hard work, but I see we have a principled notion of agency, and it shows us how the nested community structure can give us nested goals and nested bending of problem spaces. And we can actually not only talk about metaphorically about bending the problem spaces, we actually can show, I think we'll be able to show that we can actually have real space-time curved representations of bending, general relativistic descriptions of bending.
Mike, may I share, you remember we were taking this project and embedding it into the variational free energy principle and all that. So may I share now the screen to show Donna and Chetan what we already have? I mean, mind you all, this is work from 1 year ago. I still didn't get to develop it in full. It's, let's say, maybe 80% done. So on the left, you see this book. This will come soon. It's Carl's book on the free energy principle, on the nature of things. It's the big a big monograph of the latest version, I suspect. So
Yes.
we didn't push this paper because I also wanted to have access to the latest form of this before we would push. So the Synthese paper had only a few drop names of variational free energy and the decomposable way in which you can assess intelligence and true scale-free quantification and recursive decomposition in that sense. So in this project, we try to do it within the free energy principle framework, so within the variational variance framework, right? So we take all these problem space operators and embed them into a physical variational physics descriptions. And we also end up on some of the things that you Don and Chetan mentioned, like for example, when we can have the issue of renormalization and then getting ways in which you can decompose and quantify across scales additive gains in search efficiency at different scales, and then do it globally for as a whole total of the system, depending on how efficiency gains are cashed out at different levels. Yes. So that can be embedded in the variational logic of the free energy principle for sure, and using the more pedestrian thing in the sense of like the Ness assumption and the Helmholtz decomposition, and then building on that, building a minimal Landau style floor of cost per unit operator and efficiency gains. So this is not done, but what I want to say is that seeing you present this just now, it is clear to me that you provide a way more finer algebraic structure for us to probe even deeper into this decomposition, and then look at what you mentioned, the community structure and all these sort of effects you would get, and what would appear to us at the scale and metric of observation as an efficiency gain might come from innumerable ways of tiling that problem space or bending the problem space or just doing in your terms, just changing the observation frame by communities and certain communities having different policies and meta policies based on the higher order aggregates and so on. So I think it's definitely valuable, even if it were something that's built after this is pushed, because this will be finished quite soon.
Right.
It's definitely worth looking into it, and the connection with physics is certainly impressive for sure. That's the hard work. This is less hard.
Well, I would certainly welcome any interactions you guys want to have on this once your current projects are you get to a certain place, because I think as I listen to your work, I realize our ideas are really converging quite nicely here, and I think that there's a synergy. The nice thing about the Markov stuff is that it's so well studied. You just look at the eigen analysis of these matrices to get a lot of this stuff. So there are lots of papers out there about the community structure and so forth. So we would just have to do our homework and understand a lot of that stuff. We could just then port in here, and it's really quite well understood. The only thing they didn't have was the trace logic and the fact that it can recurse. That's what they were missing to pull this whole picture together.
Interesting. Very interesting. Yeah.
What do you think would happen, or maybe you've already done it, but to apply some of the causal emergence metrics to the dynamics of these things, or like some of the stuff that you guys do, Robert, or some of the more conventional stuff that we have. Have you, phi-D and all that kind of stuff? Have you done that at all?
You're done.
Well, Don on his stuff, and then if they haven't done it yet, then I'm going to say maybe we should.
So so say a little bit more about the causal emergence question. I want to make sure I understand that question.
Well, and I mean Robert's the better person to speak to it, but there are a variety of newish metrics in information theory that basically try to quantify important aspects of agency, right? So the extent to which the whole is in some sense causally more than its parts, phi, all that stuff.
Right, that kind of, exactly, right.
That's what I'm getting at. Have you tried any of those metrics on the dynamical path of these things?
Well, yeah. So a lot of that work has been the motivation between that Tononi and Co. and so forth has been to somehow have consciousness be a function of the amount of causal emergence, right? And to the extent that the phi is the system with the greatest causal measure, and those are very, very useful. I think they have nothing to do with consciousness.
Yeah, I'm not making any claims about consciousness.
Okay.
I'm just asking, just step one of getting the measurements and seeing what's going on as far as.
Sure. I think that would, as long as there's no claims about that in consciousness, I'm all for it. I think that stuff that's really good work. Absolutely. What I think is bogus is saying that consciousness has something to do with that. I think that's bogus. But yeah, but we haven't done that ourselves, so we haven't, and that would be. So the answer is we haven't gone there yet, and that.
It may be interesting to do just to get some data, just to do some measurements. I mean, we've been doing it on gene regulatory networks and all sorts of weird things, and there's some really interesting. We haven't said a word about consciousness yet with respect to that, but just the data alone, I think, are already interesting, whatever the interpretation.
But your data has really inspired me the last few months. Your work, your whole team has really inspired me. It really forced me to think out of the box about what this thing can do. So thank you. I mean, it's been really quite fun.
Thanks.
Your podcast with Lex Friedman, I've listened to it like 5 times or something like that.
Don, I mean, on this topic specifically, do you think you could use not the inverse trace as a sort of hypothesis generation for this kind of experiments and this kind of data? Because I mean, it seems like you do the construction sort of, in this paper, at least in the paper in this test, we did it mostly forward, but you do have a calculus and an algebra for doing it backwards. So you have, let's say, an observed effective kernel P sub A on the visible states A, and then with the trace chain theorem says that any consistent extension P with the hidden states A prime, was it? Yeah, A prime. Right. Then that must satisfy basically the theorem. So then the A, B, C, D is sort of like a tuples is a sort of parameterized hypothesis space about hidden mechanisms. And then it just becomes an inverse problem, right? It's just that. So if that's the case, and we have a lot of data, and in our synthesis paper we use the Planarian regeneration example, and we use the data in that literature, but there is also way more data in GRMs and stuff like that. So do you think we could have a sort of model in the inverse trace that would distinguish between different hypotheses that explain best the data that we see?
Yes, in the following sense. So the trace logic, because it's a logic, there is the notion of not only the meet, but also the join.
The join, yeah.
So I can take 2 matrices, and if they are compatible, if they're, for example, part of a Boolean sublogic, then they have a join. Now, Chetan has done the hard work of getting a closed form solution for very special cases. And it turns out to get a general closed form solution is an open problem. But the interesting thing is, so there can be a join. There can also be, so the join is the least upper bound, right, between 2. But you could also have, in some cases, Chetan has pointed out that there could be a whole, say, 1 parameter family of minimal upper bounds. So it's going to be very, very interesting. The trace logic for certain matrices, there may not be a unique least upper bound. There could be a family of minimal upper bounds, and then we may be able to use other factors to choose one that we want. Criteria. So other criteria for what we want. Maybe we want something that's some kind of minimized complexity or maximum complexity or causal structure, greatest causal structure, or something like that. So there are all sorts of things that we could do. So we don't know if there is a general closed form formula for computing the join. Chetan has it for a special case, It's a fair bet that there is not one. That's going to be interesting to it's an interesting open mathematical problem to study the join of this thing. And I can give you the unpublished paper we have so far where Chaitan's stuff is there, and you can see what we've got so far. And it's open as to, how to generalize that or to prove that it cannot be done, right? That it cannot be generalized.
Yeah, no, it's super interesting. Yeah, I would definitely love to see those papers, and I read some of your stuff, and also the latest on traces of consciousness. I went through most of it. Very.
Okay, you've seen the traces of consciousness paper, right? Okay, so it's in the appendix at the back of that paper that you already have. You'll see Chaitan's work on what we have so far in the join.
Work in progress. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I know of your work because one of my best friends is Robert Brenner. So we talk a lot. We just submitted a paper on IIT and conscious agents theory.
Oh yes, right,
1 month ago. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, of course we know Robert quite well. Yeah.
So I have a question, Don, about the definition of the trace. The trace of any Markov process is also a Markov process, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So do you have an available model of observations that are, or sequences of observations that are not Markov? So sequences of observations that violate constant probability of switching from one state to the next, so that the probability is not well defined.
Right. It depends on your time window and how you want to coarse grain the states. Right. So one could say, look, there are many systems that is not the case that if you look at the states I've given you, that the probability of the next state can be given exactly just based on the current state. You might need to look at 3 states or 5 states or 10 states or whatever, a bigger window to get the probability. But in those cases, you can always then create new states and then turn it Markov. So basically,
you can expand the state space. You actually multiply it. And there can be a combinatorial explosion, though. You do need to be aware of that possibility. And this only works for finite memory. It doesn't work for infinite memory. But even for finite memory, you do have to be a little careful that, the combinatorics can get nuts, which seems to be often the problem in consciousness research.
Right. I'm of course mainly interested in issues like contextuality and quantum theory, where you have groups of observations for which joint probabilities can't be defined. And so you can't build a single self-consistent hidden variable theory. So I don't know whether the formalism will handle that sort of situation or not. Since you do seem to be always assuming well-defined probability distributions.
Can you say more about the system that doesn't work, Chris?
Well, contextuality is defined as a phenomenon. Sets of observations over which sets of observations for which a joint probability distribution is undefinable.
Yeah.
For which the statistics violate the Kolmogorov axioms.
I suspect that the fact that joins don't always work might have something to do with that.
That's what I
in
was
this
thinking
context.
too.
Yeah, that's
I
right.
originally thought your question was about having the same probabilities every time, and of course you don't need that with Markov chains. They don't have to be homogeneous, but
Right.
that's not your question. It's more abstract than that.
Yeah.
But my hope would be to somehow find sub logics which actually look like quantum logics.
Right.
But that if that happens, then we could possibly answer your question in affirmative. I mean, that would be one way to do it.
Okay. So another way to think of it in your formalism might be if there are paths. Yeah, this would be where it would look like a quantum logic. If you have paths in the trace logic network that don't commute.
Oh, easily.
Yeah.
Right.
That may be a way of approaching this join question, Ben.
Matrices have no join.
Yeah, to get back to your comment about unitarity at the very beginning, and unitarity is really just conservation of information. And Kolmogorov probability is really just conservation of information. So if you don't have situations in which information is actually lost in some global sense, sort of informational singularities, if you will, then the system satisfies unitarity as it's used as an axiom within the information theory, which is just conservation of information. So this is where I was trying to emphasize this complete dissociation, actually, of unitarity from any spatial considerations. But okay, anyway, that's sort of an aside. The real question is about contextuality.
Right. Yeah, it is striking that Nima, Arkani Hamed, and these high energy theoretical physicists are strident that they're not assuming unitarity. They're strident about it. They're saying we don't need it, and we'll show that it arises from these positive geometries that are entirely outside of space-time. So they're getting space-time and unitarity together.
I've never seen a demonstration of that fact as it in itself. What I have seen is they derive scattering amplitudes and which match what's understood from the Feynman approach. Yeah. That doesn't mean you've derived space-time, and it doesn't mean you've derived unitarity. It just means that you've matched something.
Yeah, I think they're referring.
The principle is absent.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, I think they're referring to unitary processes in space-time.
Right.
That's what they're referring to. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right.
That's very different from unitarity as a strictly information theoretic concept.
And yet the way they wave it around and say we don't assume space-time or unitarity, right?
Yeah. It's just a disconnect in language, I think.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, it's fine not assuming a collection B when you're doing a collection A, but if somebody like Dyson comes around and says they're equivalent, then you can't say that we don't need space-time. It's just another way of looking at it. So they have, their claim is unfounded as far as I know. I mean, somebody needs to sit down and say this is how space-time emerges from the amplituhedron.
No.
Otherwise, it just saying that Schwinger could say I don't need to assume Feynman, and Feynman could say I don't need to assume Schwinger, and they're both right, but they're both equivalent.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Right now they don't give you space-time; they give you scattering amplitudes. That's what they give you.
Right, which are things are defined in space-time. Fair enough.
Yeah, I, 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 I suspect that eventually we'll generally be able to identify amplitude-hedron-like structures with quantum error-correcting codes.
You
And
wrote a paper
they're-
on that, didn't you, Chris?
Well, we're in the we have a preprint of it that was revised as of a few months ago, and we're still working on it. But the current available preprint isn't bad. But the hypothesis would be we can go the other way from amplitude-hedron-like structures to quantum error-correcting codes. And there are many ways to get spacetime from quantum error-correcting codes. So
Interesting.
it may be that the inference ends up going in that direction, through that direction.
Whoa. Sky
What I'm hoping to be able to show is that some of these positive geometries, like the associahedron, are sub-polytopes of the Markov polytope. So that, because the Markov polytope could be describing the probabilities of certain interactive processes that we would think of as scattering processes. And so if that's the case, then I would, there may be a deep connection between some of these positive geometries and the Markov hedron, which is itself a positive geometry.
Yeah.
The set of all possible Markov chains is a positive geometry.
Yeah. Yeah, I suspect that any such structure defined over any space of possibilities, or any such dynamics defined over any space of possibilities, can be thought of as scattering in some,
Right.
metaphorical but formally sensible way.
Yeah.
I mean,
Scattering is
computation. We can think of computation as scattering in
right.
data structure
Interaction.
space.
Interaction is scattering.
Yeah.
I mean, scattering is how interactions look in a physics lab.
Well, what's surprising is how restricted the scattering events are that you find in physics, right? There's a very restricted set, and it turns out that something like the standard model gives you all the components that you're ever going to find in any scattering that you ever do. And
We hope. Yeah.
so far, well, yeah, that's so far.
Well, all the ones that you see with the sorts of things that we call elementary particles.
Right. What I find interesting is, just as when we had the Ptolemaic system, we had all cycles and cycles and cycles, you could get all the orbits of the planets, but it was ugly and just a mess, because you had to add all these cycles and correcting cycles to correct those cycles and so forth to do it. And the same thing happens with space-time and scattering. You look at the Feynman diagrams, it's loop after loop, and you have 3 or 4 particle interactions and 500 pages of algebra, because you have all these Ptolemaic loop after loop after loop where you're enforcing locality and unitarity. So Feynman is enforcing locality and unitarity, and so we have to do all this stuff. And all of a sudden, 400 pages of algebra turns into 2 terms when you let go of space-time. And also it feels again like we got this Rube Goldberg machine called space-time, and that's why things look so ugly in space-time and the mathematics. And all of a sudden we're seeing some hint. I mean, it was a big hint when we went from Ptolemy to Newton. That's, all of a sudden the formulas got a lot. So we're onto something much deeper here than Ptolemy was onto. And now when we go from, Feynman scattering diagrams to these positive geometries, once again, we're getting 400 pages of algebra down to 2 terms, a clear hint that we're onto something deeper beyond space-time.
Yeah. No, space-time's a kludge. I think that's clear.
Space-time's a
it's
kludge. Holy cow.
But what's interesting is that theories of consciousness, all the main theories of consciousness assume otherwise. We start with space-time. We try to figure out what physical systems in space-time could possibly have the right structure to give rise to consciousness.
Yeah.
So all of our theories start with the kludge as the assumption, and then try to go from there. So they're doomed, completely doomed to failure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, all of science has done this before about, what, 1970?
You're talking about the Standard Model since about 1970?
Since Pure
Well,
River.
no, I'm roughly dating. Roughly dating at least the first things I saw from
that's the
Wheeler
Carbon
with
River.
the notion of observer participants in it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right in the 70s, right?
yeah,
Yeah, he saw it. He knew. I mean, he wrote the book on space-time. He wrote the book on gravity.
right.
Miesler, Thorne, and Wheeler. That is the Bible, and he knew space-time, and he knew it was a kludge. He was looking for something entirely beyond,
Right. Yeah.
and he called it observer participants. That's what he
Right.
called it.
May
Well,
I
good to
ask
see-
something? Oh,
Yeah.
go ahead. Go ahead,
I was
Chris.
just going to say, good to see you guys again, and good to meet you, Robert.
Good to meet you, Chris. And I think we will meet in person in Spain, if I'm not mistaken, in July.
Yes, hopefully. That sounds very
Hopefully.
exciting.
Yeah. I told them to invite you specifically.
Thank you.
Good.
What's happening in Spain?
There will be a workshop organized by some people, the Tatiana Foundation, and it's a workshop on the known unknowns in our fields of interest. And there will be more than one field is fields.
Okay.
So Chris Fields.
So that's why
going to be
Fields
there.
is
Excellent.
We'll discuss several things. But Don, I wanted to say that I think this is the biggest myopia in consciousness science. And I work in Anil Seth's lab. I did my PhD with Giulio Tononi. I did a postdoc with David Chalmers. I work with Georg Notov and the temporospatial. I know all the people.
Yeah.
And all of them are sort of either physicalists or they still think that consciousness is something you squeeze with enough dexterity at the end of a long tube that you operationally construct. And they really don't get the point that consciousness is the starting point.
Oh.
And everything else must come afterwards. You build everything else from consciousness, not the other way. And it's hard.
These guys.
I know the pain.
Michael, do you see your
pain.
the Platonic space as having something to do with consciousness
So Platonic space
in that
is
sense, or being embedded within it?
That's Mike's answer.
that's Mike's thing.
Yeah, that's I'm asking Mike.
Well, so I'm not fundamentally a consciousness researcher. I don't have any strong claims on this yet. But if I had to say right now, I would say that I don't think that from the point of the Platonic space formalism that I'm investigating, I don't think that we are beings that occasionally get visited by Platonic patterns that are something else. I think we are the patterns. And I think these patterns are a wide range of, static, dynamic, low agency, high agency things. And I think what we call consciousness is the perspective from the Platonic space outwards into. So what a pattern from the Platonic space experiences when it interacts with the physical world is what we tend to call consciousness. Now, I'm not sure that I don't think that exhausts all the possibilities. I think there are probably lateral interactions within that world. I suspect that when mathematicians think about abstract mathematical objects, what happens is there are basically two different patterns in resonance there, the human one and the whatever it is that they're studying. So there may be lateral interactions that don't even require the physical world per se. But basically what I think we mean when we talk about consciousness is what it's like to be a Platonic pattern projecting into a physical world through some interface. So that might be, the sense organs that we have or something completely different, and so on.
So the Platonic patterns transcend our experiential notion of consciousness.
In the sense that, Well, say more. What do you mean about that?
But there's a Platonic realm that maybe we shouldn't describe as conscious, but we perceive, but a human perspective on it is we experience it as consciousness sort of looking at it somehow. So consciousness is just a perspective.
Yeah, ultimately, I think some version of idealism is probably the more accurate thing. Like, I do think that consciousness is fundamental, but I don't know what to do with that on a practical level right now. Like, I don't have a way of making use of that in the lab or anything like that. What I see is a way to make progress with a somewhat more dualistic version, which, I agree that it would be nice to have some kind of simple monism, but what I see right now is that we have different but interacting realms, so to speak, that model helps us to do new experiments and make new discoveries. So for now, I do think that they're sort of two separate things. But ultimately, if I had to guess, I would say that consciousness is primary. I don't know how to do that reduction right now, so I'm sticking with two because that's what we can handle right now.
Right. Yeah. One of our goals is to show that we can actually get space-time, special and general relativity, and quantum theory from this theory of Markov chains of consciousness. In which case, then we could inherit all the work that's been done in physics, but see it arising from a consciousness first point of view. So that's where I'm headed.
Yeah, I mean, for us, one of the important pieces of our research program is to understand the mapping between the interfaces that we construct. And those are anything from sorting algorithms through cyborgs, through xenobots, embryos, you name it, like all of these stuff, to understand what are the properties of these things that facilitate the ingression of specific patterns from the space. Like,
Right.
what is it about this thing you've made that pulls down this rather than that? And that allows different degrees of and different kinds of minds to interact through it, and also to quantify. And so we've got some wild stuff that's kind of ripening in the next few months that I'd love to run by all of you. We should all have another meeting so you can see. But
Yes.
we've been trying to quantify. Like, one of the things that I think is really important about this Platonic space thing is that it's not just a redescription, and a bunch of sort of useless, philosophy that you sprinkle on top of things that work perfectly well. It actually makes very new predictions in the sense that it suggests that what you're getting from that space are things that, using conventional theories that we have now of doing the accounting of effort, of computational cost, of physical cost, these kinds of things, that you get free lunches, or at least heavily discounted lunches. You get more than you put in. Our accounting isn't adding up everything that you get. We're missing something very significant, and we now have the ability to quantify how much are we getting, how much free memory, free compute, free whatever. We can, at least in simple minimal models, we can quantify that. In biology, you can see it, but it's hard to quantify or prove anything. It's just too complicated. Whereas in these minimal models, we can actually quantify, what did we get that we didn't pay for according to the conventional way of totaling up effort. Right. So and so that's really important to find out how much and what do you get. Do you just get static patterns? Do you get behavioral propensities? Do you algorithms? Do you get virtual machines? Do you get free compute that you can do in that space? Like, that's a kind of a crazy prediction of mine that I think you can actually get. You can do compute in that space that you don't pay for in this space, so to speak. Right. So that's
I've been listening to a lot of your podcasts on this and thinking about it, and I think that there's connection with the hidden states in this Markov system, so that if we just see a trace, most of the intelligence is something you don't see. And so to the trace observer, that's all in a Platonic realm, because you literally cannot see it. And yet what you're seeing is entirely a trace of that world. So your visible world is controlled by this quote unquote Platonic space that you cannot see. And so that's why I was thinking, that's what your stuff about the planaria, for example. You cut off the head and cut off the tail, and you can change the the electric fields and make it have two heads and so forth. I mean, it's just, how does it know how to do that? Right, where is that? So I've been thinking, so somehow all we're seeing is the planaria in our trace. We're not seeing beyond what we can see. There's a whole Markov realm of intelligence out there that is projecting down into what we can see, which is just the planarian. But so I'd really love to explore with you guys, as this formalism matures, how we might use the formalism in concrete ways to model specific Platonic spaces for specific memories, biological memories. Because I think this gives us the tools, right? There are the exits, the dark states, and the entrances. All those tools are part of the Platonic space. And if we learn, so we're new to this ourselves, right? We don't know how to use those tools yet, but to learn how to use those tools to model specific things, we might be able to get that Platonic space, not just a hand wave, but here is the Markov chain, here's the trace, and this is why it looks like this Platonic intelligence that's guiding you. But it would be multi-scale, right? There's going to be multi-scale in the dark space.
Well, what might be really fun is so definitely we should do that with some of the biology examples that we have. In particular, for example, with some of the synthetic things that we have, so xenobots and neurobots, because they raise what I think is perhaps the most interesting part of this is where do the goals and properties of novel beings come from, where you can't just pin it on selection, eons of selection, right? Like, so where do they come from? So, I would complement that with, which I think would be even easier, the study of basically applying these things to some of the minimal computational models that we have.
Yes.
Right. We have sorting is one, and there's going to be a bunch of new work on that coming soon. But we have others. We have some really interesting stuff that'll come out soon on giving embodiments to various very weird sources like mathematical objects, and making robots that are driven not by conventional algorithms and sensors and whatever, but their entire behavior is driven by pre-cooked static mathematical constants, and watching how those kinds of, or mathematical objects, and watching how those things end up navigating a world and adapt, and what cognitive features they end up having and so on. So I think those things are simple enough that we could actually make a pretty tight mapping onto what you have in terms of states and things like that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Fascinating. It may be, though, when you get into pure mathematics and sort of a hidden Platonic realm that's doing stuff, like sorting algorithms that are doing other things you didn't expect. I'm having my mind stretched to think about how Markov chains could do that. That seems like that might be something even deeper somehow.
Well, what we could, that was the other thing I was thinking, what is totally doable now is to take your system and apply the tests that we have. So we have a range of assays that basically are taken right out of the behaviorist handbook, because the one thing I think behaviorists got right is that they weren't worried about what the implementation was, and so it's very easy to apply their tools to anything, right? So we could actually look for habituation, sensitization, associative conditioning, delayed gratification, path planning, illusion, counterfactuals, all this kind of stuff. We have assays now that we can look for all that stuff.
Yeah, well, and it's clear to me that there's always going to be Markov chains that we can build to do that. So it'll be, they're universal Turing machines. Markov chains are universal.
Yeah. So I'm not talking about building ones that do it. I'm talking about finding it in simple or random ones that you don't think should be doing it. That's the trick.
Okay.
We're finding this. We're finding these capacities in very simple and no design, no selection. Usually the three things you think you normally need. You need rational design by an engineer, selection or evolution, or learning. Right? Those are the three things you need. One of those three things you need. We're not doing any of that. We're pulling it out of I don't know. You'll judge for yourself where you think it's coming from. But I think we could do that with random matrices or whatever.
That's right. We may be able to find matrices which what we're seeing in the organism is the trace, but but the invisible states are having a lot of the intelligence that leads to what you're seeing. And so we write down the matrix that even though the trace, you can't see why it's doing that, but it does it. But in the big matrix, you see why it's doing it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm going to have to jump off, guys. Great conversation.
Thanks, Chris. Good to
Chris,
see you.
All
always a
right.
pleasure.
Yeah. See you.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris.
Good to see you, Chris.
Yeah.
Mike, we will have the recording of this.
Yes, yes, it is being recorded. Yep, I will. I'll send you guys a link.
Awesome.
Yeah, if everybody's okay with it, I'll put it up on our center channel. But regardless, you can all have a copy. You can have a copy of it.
That's fine with me. Yeah.
Great.
And that's what
Perfectly
we're
fine.
listening to.
Right.
Yeah.
About
Yeah, I think there's a ton of stuff to do. So why don't we
12 hours
go
later.
off and think about some specific directions, and let's come back. I already have some thoughts, but there'll be lots more in a few weeks when when I can send around some preprints. I'm having my students write these things up, and so then
Yeah.
I'll send them
Very
out.
good. And if we then pick a particular simple problem system that we can see what the trace logic might do on it and
Yeah.
see where we go from there. That would be fun.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Great.
And I think a natural
Good luck.
extension of our formalism, Mike, after we did the FEP thing, is basically try to apply all this stuff to it,
Yeah.
and see how you can get even deeper, more interesting things you can say about all this computing intelligence across scales in more
Yes.
fine-grained manner than even the FEP allows.
Yep.
So yeah, I think
So
it's
reading your
definitely
paper,
something.
I agree that this seemed to be a natural connection with what the project you guys are doing right now. Absolutely. Yeah.
Good.
Wasn't that fascinating? I love cutting edge science. Oh, so this is the cool. Oh, wait. This might not be it. So this is the Green River. The Duwamish. Okay, I know where that is. That's where you get on the Green River Trail. It's where the Green River Trail kind of ends / starts. I think there's a little trail here. Getting chunky. Seattle's a big city. That's Seattle, right next to Plain Sim 1. I guess they're at King County International, or King County Metro. It's the sun. All right, let's see if we can land this pig. Landing with the wind, but okay. That's King County International. actually there. I just love this place where I live. Oh yeah, the sun just set. Oops, I'm too high. Loading airplanes. Oh yeah, I bet it is. What is this? You want me to go all the way back here? Oh, the GA is back there. That's not where you keep the general aviation stuff. It's behind me. It's back there. Well, I will say that Sim Update 5 has made some real progress towards not having airports be death machines. This is really where the general aviation goes. Interesting. Okay. Parking brake. Okay. I think I can turn this all off. I want to turn off the engine first. All right. Oh, I guess you got to turn on the battery. Turn on the battery. Turn on the avionics. I get it now.
TOS system test. Okay.
Interesting. Control. So I guess you got to turn those on. Turn those on. Cool. Good to know. Cool. Nice to know. I don't know about your airplane. Oh. Okay, the airport is a little bit gnarly. Okay, I'm done. It's a fun airplane. Thank you, got friends. You always do such great work. I flew all the way from close to Wenatchee to back to Seattle through the mountains. Not bad. Boy, I wish there was I wish you could have different settings for when you're landing. That's what it really needs. It needs, I'm landing, give me minimum eye candy so that I can actually land my airplane.